Before I introduce today's guest, I wanted to tell you about our sponsor, which is the Great Courses Plus. This is what it looks like. It's an app on your phone right there. And this is the teaching company, the Great Courses, that I've been a fan of and consumer of for many years. And before, you had to go online and purchase a course and take the entire course, and that's all you got. Now, with the Great Courses Plus program, they have a subscription program. So if you subscribe, then you have access to hundreds of thousands of courses, and therefore tens of thousands of lectures. If you get tired of a course, just switch to another course. I do it all the time. I'll hit 2 or 3 or half a dozen lectures in a particular subject. I get bored, or I just want to try something different, and I'll switch to new one. So let's just see what pops up here, because they also are pretty current. So I hit that, and we get America's Long Struggle Against Slavery. Okay, it's pretty obvious why that's popped up now, as I'm recording this in the middle of the riots and looting and all that over the death of George Floyd. And so I touch on that, and then you get a list of the lectures to choose from: Understanding the Fight Against Slavery, The Origins of Slavery in the British Empire, The African Slave Trade, and so on and so forth, all the way down. Slavery and the War for Independence, the Haitian Revolution. It looks like there is 30 lectures ending in slavery by another name, probably slave labor, and fighting modern slavery. So I'm going to listen to a few of those. The deal is, if you go to their site, the Great Courses, greatcoursesplus.com/salon, you get a free trial, and as a listener of my podcast. So I recommend it. I consume their lectures all the time, along with audiobooks, so I recommend that you do that. Perfect time in this era of social isolation. So with that, thanks for the support from the greatcoursesplus.com/salon. My guest this week is Howard Bloom. His new book is called Einstein, Michael Jackson, and Me: A Search for Soul in the Power Pits of Rock and Roll. Howard is based out of Park Slope, Brooklyn. He's been called the next in a lineage of seminal thinkers that includes Newton, Darwin, Einstein, and Freud by Britain's Channel 4 TV, and the next Stephen Hawking by Gear magazine. One of Bloom's 7 books, Global Brain, was the subject of an Office of Secretary of Defense symposium with participants from the State Department, the Energy Department, DARPA, IBM, and MIT. His book, Global Brain, was on the internet. He's also done other books, The Lucifer Principle and The God Problem. So we actually get into all of that in this conversation, but mainly the focus is on his rather non-traditional career path as something of a precocious whiz kid. Analogy I made is he's like Sheldon on The Big Bang Theory. Super smart kid, realized he was an atheist at age 10, I think he said, and how that led him to science, and then weirdly, in that non-traditional career path, into rock and roll as a promoter. And so we get into what makes somebody a creative musician, in his case, the arts of music. And then we get into Michael Jackson and the details of that rather controversial example of creativity and other issues related to the accusations against him. And then the search for God. Really, I think my listeners will appreciate this, that God is this sort of thing inside of us that longs for some connection to a higher power or something beyond us. It doesn't have to be a God entity. And music is one way to look at that. Anyway, Howard's a strict materialist atheist like me. He's a hardcore skeptic. So it's interesting to kind of explore these themes metaphorically and then using the best of science. So the conversation's pretty wide ranging, super interesting. But again, I always appreciate people who have a non-traditional path toward the sciences and these interesting topics, and his certainly is. And so I hope you enjoy this conversation with Howard Bloom. Howard Bloom, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on. Your new book is Einstein, Michael Jackson, and Me: A Search for the Soul in the Power Pits of Rock and Roll. My listeners will know you from your science books, The God Problem, The Lucifer Principle, and The Global Brain. When I told people I was having you on, that's what came to mind. I don't think they think of you as a rock and roll promoter. So this book is kind of a nice overview of your rather, shall we say, non-traditional career path. You were the founder of Howard Bloom Organization, the original HBO. You promoted the likes of Michael Jackson, Prince, Bob Marley, Bette Midler, Billy Joel, Billy Idol, Paul Simon, Peter Gabriel, David Byrne, AC/DC, Aerosmith, Queen, Kiss, and so on, 100 more. I thought you could give us a sort of a potted biography of how you went from that to being a well-known science writer, starting with your chapter that opens with the Einstein imperative. When I was 12, one of the girls in my 8th grade class swung her gaze in my direction and said, "I told my mother you understand the theory of relativity." It was the first time any girl in class had ever made eye contact with me. It was startling, and the statement presented a challenge I could not ignore, as guys are wont to do. In these days, it was said that only 7 men in the world could understand the theory of relativity. And I certainly didn't understand it, but I wasn't going to confess that to the only woman who had ever looked in my direction in my entire 8 years of schooling. So when classes let out, I jumped on my bicycle, pedaled to the local library where the librarians knew me better than my mother did, and asked them for everything they had on the theory of relativity. They gave me 2 books, a great big fat book written by Albert Einstein and 2 collaborators, and a little skinny book written by Einstein on his own. I started with the fat one. I have to say, I started with the skinny one, and I'm still not sure I understand it. But so that's a great beginning. That was your introduction to science, and then take us from there.
Well, the introduction to science came when I was 10, if you can believe that. I was sitting in my family's great big living room. A book appeared on my lap that I'd never seen before. I was a lost and confused child. My parents had literally no time for me. And other kids didn't want to have anything to do with me. And this book said the first 2 principles of science are these: the truth at any price, including the price of your life, and look at things right under your nose as if you've never seen them before, and then proceed from there. And it gave the example of Galileo for principle number 1, which of course you know and I know is wrong. Now I know that. I didn't at the age of 10, because Galileo, it pretended that Galileo was willing to die for his truth. No, he made a deal with his friend, the Pope, and he said he would swear that everything he'd ever written was false in exchange for being given house arrest instead of going to the stake. And for number 2, look at things right under your nose as if you've never seen them before, and then proceed from there. It gave Anton von Leeuwenhoek the inventor of the microscope. So all of a sudden I had 2 galvanizing principles, and I had a group of friends who could not reject me for a very simple reason. The friends were people like Einstein, who was still alive at the time, but way, way far away, and Galileo and Anton von Leeuwenhoek, who were not alive. And these 2 guys could not reject me because they were dead. So by the time I was 12 years old, I had begun to collect some tiny little credentials in science. I built my first Boolean algebra machine. I co-designed a computer that won some science fair awards. I was taken off to the University of Buffalo to meet with the head of the graduate physics department, who turned what must have been a 5-minute courtesy call into an hour-long session, because we were brainstorming about the hottest topic in science that year, which was the interpretation of the Doppler shift and the implications for Big Bang versus steady state theory of the universe. And after an hour, we came out of his office. He loomed over me, he put his hand on my shoulder, and he told my mom, you don't have to save for grad school for him. He'll get fellowships in theoretical physics at any school he wants in the country. So, and I was also, my mom, even though she didn't have time for me, she managed to convince the head of research and development for the Moog Valve Corporation to give me private tutorials in outside-the-box science, how to think outside the box. So science was my métier. It was, and then I worked at the world's largest cancer research center when I was 16, and spent the summer trying to solve what was called the CPT problem, the charge parity and time problem, which says that if matter and antimatter are created in equal amounts at the same time, where's all the antimatter?
Yeah.
You hear that question still being posed today.
Yeah.
And this was I call it the big bagel. It was a Bloom toroidal model of the universe that I came up with that explained the beginning, middle, and end of the universe, and predicted something that wouldn't be found for another 38 years, dark energy, and explains how dark energy works. And if you want to see it, it's very simple. It's in a 5.5-minute animation on YouTube that's had 800,000 views a little bit over that so far.
Okay.
But when I was 13, something really bizarre happened to me. First of all, at 12, I'd realized I was an atheist. And then the high holidays came around, and I'm Jewish. So at any rate, I'm a Jewish atheist. So I realized,
were your parents Jewish? Were your parents atheists?
They were religious.
Oh.
They weren't. They were not observant, is what it's called.
Okay.
In other words, they showed up at the temple when there was a wedding or a bar mitzvah, and it was one of their friends' kids who was being married or bar mitzvah. That was it, except for the high holidays. These two holidays that come around, Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, in September. Well, Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah rolled around, and my parents somehow got me in a suit, which is almost impossible, and they got me into their car. But once we reached the avenue where the synagogue was, they couldn't get me out of their car. And I was clinging onto this American-made heavy-duty door frame, and my parents were clawing at me at my ankles, trying to get me out on the sidewalk. And I had a sudden realization. I don't believe there are gods in the heavens. I don't believe there are gods underneath the ground. But there are gods in this scene. Where are they? They're inside my parents. And if they're inside my parents, then they're universal. And if they're universal, then they're inside of me. So my task became to find the gods inside of us, meaning to find the ecstatic experiences, the really extraordinary emotional experiences that are far from the norm inside of us, that are the gods speaking from within us to our rational, conscious selves.
Yeah.
And then I heard of the existence of a book called The Varieties of the Religious Experience. And I thought, oh my God, that's exactly what I'm doing. I had to find a copy. There was no Amazon in those days. It took me 4 months. It was Buffalo, New York, for God's sakes. It's not exactly a book-rich city. And finally, I found a copy, and it was as if William James had laid a bunch of experiences out on a lab table in Petri dishes and said, with my science, the science I have in 1902, I cannot solve the mysteries of these bizarre experiences. But you're going to come along at least 50 years later, and you will have more advanced tools. And I'm leaving these as a legacy to you. And the one thing that he did say was that the kinds of experiences he was talking about, St. Teresa's crazy visions when she was alone in a stone cell at night and she felt Christ coming through the walls and piercing her and lifting her above the world in ways that were ecstatic beyond all belief, or George Fox, who invented the Quaker religion and who would see rivers of blood coming down the streets of Lichfield in England. So what James was saying is that these experiences, for all practical purposes, can be labeled psychopathological. They're illnesses, they're insanities. But in the hands of certain people, insanities become the engines of history. So that was it. I was up and running. It wasn't my only quest in science by any stretch of the imagination. But one of the key quests in science for me was, how do you find these astonishing ecstatic experiences? And eventually...
So you believe in the gods that exist inside people's heads, not just members of ISIS really believe what they say they believe or whatever, but all of us have some kind of God force within us in the sense of looking for ecstatic experiences or spiritualism or awe and wonder at the cosmos. So therefore something like Carl Sagan's pale blue dot soliloquy is a kind of spiritual experience. We all crave that.
Right, because we all crave to be a part of something larger than ourselves.
Yeah.
And the other formative experience form. And there are many ways that we achieve that. And religion is just one of them.
Yeah.
And that's what I would eventually discover. I mean, why did I eventually end up in rock and roll? Well, it was a matter of a whole bunch of accidents. I didn't belong in rock and roll. That was the music of the kids who beat me up. That wasn't my music. I listened to Rachmaninoff, Beethoven, Bartok, Stravinsky, people like that. But when I got a chance to go into rock and roll, I had on the one hand 4 fellowships in what is now today called neuroscience. And on the other hand, I had an opportunity to go into something I knew absolutely nothing about, popular culture. Mm-hmm. And in popular culture, I was hoping I could find the gods. And I had a wife, and I got married at 21 when I was just between my freshman and sophomore year at NYU. And my wife made it very clear that her first husband, by whom she'd had her baby, who was now 5, that her first husband had been a student at Dartmouth, and she was pretty damn tired of having student husbands. So I stood a chance if I accepted. I had actually accepted the grad school fellowship at Columbia University, and I stood a good chance of losing her. And I had an opportunity to go into the field that actually interested me. And Michael, the idea of grading paper and pencil tests for 22 college students at a time in exchange for a psychology credit seemed like Auschwitz for the mind to me, because there was no way I was going to get near those ecstatic experiences where the gods are. No way at all. I'd be kept from it my entire career. It would have been, it would have bleached my brain dry. And because I staggered and stumbled my way into rock and roll, all of a sudden I realized, holy moly, I'm in the land where the gods are.
Take us back just a moment to your deconversion experience, as it were. Presumably you were raised to believe in God of some kind without it being a regular feature of your life. But at some point, age 12, I think you said, age 10, you realize you don't believe in God. There's a vast literature on how people find religion and convert to God. There's not so much on how people go the direction you did. What triggered it?
Well, I'm not quite sure. I suspect I was reading, at the age of 10, I started reading 2 books a day. I never paid attention in school. I didn't bother. I was too busy reading a book under the desk, and then I'd read another book when I got home. And most of those books were science fiction, but a lot of those books weren't. I was reading a lot of science nonfiction as well. And what I suspect is that I either read Bertrand Russell's argument against Christianity, which is a very well-reasoned argument against the existence or belief in God, or I read a summary of that argument in some other book. And it all made sense. I mean, if there's a God, then God invented death. If there's a God, then God invented suffering. What kind of God would produce agonies in human beings? What sort of God would kill humans off? If it came down to something that a poet, Archibald MacLeish, would later say, if God is good, he is not God. If God is God, he is not good. In other words, if God is omnipotent, then he's created an awful lot of hideous, monstrous things. On the other hand, if God is, if God is good, and then these things were not created by him, in which case he's not all powerful. Something else is responsible for creating death and suffering. At any rate, it just made a great deal of sense. And plus, if it takes a God to create a universe, then who created God? You know, the infinite regress problem.
Yeah.
All of that made total sense. But my bar mitzvah was coming up, Michael. And because I was not a popular kid, and that's an understatement, I'd never been invited to a party before. And this was going to be the first party I was invited to. Plus, people were going to bring presents. And who could resist presents, including checks in some cases?
Right.
So I realized sometime around February that I didn't believe in God. And I shuffled it off to a corner of my mind where I could deny responsibility for it, where I could claim that I still believed in God. And another reason I knew there was no God is because in my school, we went bowling periodically. And my bowling scores, I prayed for 200 bowling scores, perfect bowling scores, but I ended up with bowling scores of 60. I mean, you know, a decorticated toad could get bowling scores of 60. So that was another clear proof that there was no God. So I realized there was no God, but I tucked it in a closet of my brain, and I went through the bar mitzvah, and I spent 2 months writing thank you notes for all of the presents. And then on the last day of writing thank you notes, approximately August 30th, I could finally confess to myself with a clear mind that I didn't believe in God. But guess what comes up in September in the Jewish calendar? the two high holidays. So it was only a week or two after my realization that I did not believe in God and thus was an atheist that my parents were trying to drag me out of their blue Fraser on Richmond Avenue in Buffalo, New York, to wrestle me up to the synagogue. And where I had this realization. Now, something else about this realization, that my job was going to be to find the gods inside of us. Galileo took a device that had been invented for horizontal viewing. It had been invented so that the folks in Holland, Hans Lippershey in Holland, had invented it. He called it the spyglass. Why? Because using it, you could spot the armies of the Spanish coming over the horizon before they could spot you. And Galileo did something absolutely outrageous. He took that device made for horizontal viewing and he turned it in a totally unexpected direction, straight up. Now, what was outrageous about that? It's simple. Everybody knew exactly what was up there. People had known what was up there for 2,000 years. People had known what was up there since before Ptolemy. Why? Because Aristotle said the perfect form was the circle. So obviously everything was circles up there. Plus, you have the audacity to look into the sky with one of these spyglasses? Surely then you must be joking. This is looking up God's underwear. This simply is not done. And yet Galileo did it and changed the course of science. And von Leeuwenhoek was a draper. He imported fabrics. The global trade was going great guns at that point and sold them. And he used a lens. The lens was, at that moment in time, it pretty much the same time for Galileo, was a little bit earlier, and von Leeuwenhoek, who was a little bit later. But in their century, the lens was the hot new device. It wasn't new. It had been around since 1200, but it was treated as if it were brand new and a breakthrough device. So von Leeuwenhoek decided he had a lens in order to look up close at the fabric he was importing and see how fine and regular the weave was. And then he decided, again, to take a device that was designed for horizontal viewing. What is beeping? Does that? No, that's not going to do anything.
Time for you to do push-ups.
Yes, we'll just have to talk later.
Actually, let me note parenthetically while you're on that, the other use of the telescope was to look to see which merchant ships were coming in. So they could prepare the markets. Yes.
Coffee houses.
So
right.
war and commerce were the two. Yeah, for that.
Amazing. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, and then my other favorite story about Galileo in the I don't know if you're going to get to Saturn, but I use this as an example in my book, The Believing Brain, of the interaction between our models and our observations, our concepts and our percepts. That is to say, Galileo did make some amazing discoveries with his telescope of the sun, the moon, spots on the sun that Aristotle said shouldn't be there, craters on the moon or shadows on the moon that shouldn't be there. Jupiter that had, moons going around it. So clearly the Earth wasn't the only center of revolution and so forth. But when he got to Saturn, he couldn't, the lenses weren't too good. So he couldn't quite make out what it was he was looking at. So the percept was not high quality. The data was poor quality, but also there was no concept of planetary rings.
Yes.
So he wrote about, Saturn looks like it has two ears on the side, or maybe two big moons going around it, and it looks different times of the year. He never did figure it out. It was Christian Huygens 50 years later that where the observations were better because the telescopes were better. And then also the idea that a planet could have rings around it, and then you put those two together and you get an actual correct model for the time. So I find that interesting. If you don't have the concept, then the percepts are going to mean something different than when you do have that model. Right.
That's absolutely true. And it's a pleasure to hear this coming from you. I mean, this is why I read your books. So
anyway.
At any rate, so what von Leeuwenhoek had done was he had taken this device made for horizontal viewing, and he had turned it down, and he had looked at pond water. And in pond water, he had found what he called animalcules, and he got all excited. He also looked at human sperm, fresh human sperm, and again, animalcules. And he wrote an excited letter, or possibly more than one, to the Royal Society, and the Royal Society accepted it, which means that when it comes to the fresh human sperm, it took me something like 30 years to figure this out. Where did he get the fresh human sperm? He was confessing to the Royal Society that he had masturbated. Now, that is an act of courage. That is a real act of
Yeah.
looking at what is right under your nose as if you've never seen it before, and then proceeding from there. So, as my parents are trying to shred my socks and get me up the street to the synagogue, it hit me that each one of these people, Galileo with his looking upwards and von Leeuwenhoek with his looking downwards, had taken the lens and focused it in a different direction. And I realized that my task among my tasks, was going to be, my scientific task was going to be to focus the lens inside of us and find the gods inside of us. Now, I was not to be the first one by any stretch of the imagination, because Freud had been doing that for a very long time.
Yeah. Now, parenthetically, did at some point you tell your parents, I just don't believe anymore, there's no point in going to the synagogue, and did they get upset or?
I told them. I can't remember their emotional reaction, but they sent me to confirmation class, something that Jews imitated from the Catholics. Mm-hmm. God knows what confirmation means in the Jewish religion. I'm not sure. But I spent a month of that class arguing with the rabbi about the existence of God, trotting out argument after argument after argument. And the rabbi threw me out of the confirmation class. So he was a little bit more emotional about this than my parents were.
So you're a pretty precocious child. I mean, to be thinking about the problem of evil and theodicy and all that, making these arguments at age 10, 12, 13, whatever, that's pretty, you're sort of the Sheldon of Big Bang Theory at that time.
Well, I had no choice. I wasn't given any normal social role that anybody would allow me in. And this is the only anything where I seem to belong. I mean, look what happened with the head of the graduate physics department. There was an actual human who not only accepted me, but was glad to be able to debate really, really hot topics with me. So by the time my wife pressured me out of accepting my grad school fellowships, I welcomed it because I really needed to do what the scientific imperative from the time I was 12 was telling me to do. And I wasn't quite sure how to do it, though I thought that popular culture would somehow give me a shot at it. And it just so happened that in my junior year of college, the poet in residence at NYU said, "Bloom, wait till everybody leaves the class, then close the door. I want to talk to you." Well, this doesn't sound good, Michael. So I closed the door and I sat down in the bawling out chair, and he said, "Look, I asked you last year to be on the staff of the literary magazine, and you never even showed up. This year, I'm telling you, you are the editor of the literary magazine. You are the literary magazine. You don't even have a faculty advisor. You are the literary magazine the minute you walk out that door. Now walk out that door." And I walked out that door looking terribly confused, and a student stopped and said, "You look disturbed about something," and asked me what it was, and I explained that I'd just been named the editor of the literary magazine, and I found literary magazines to be the dullest looking things you've ever seen in your life. The typefaces were terrible. The eggshell blue of the covers was enough to empty out the main living room or the main bedroom in an orgy. And he said, "Well, if you could do anything you wanted with it, what would you do?" And I said I'd make it a picture book. So I gathered a bunch of artists and turned it into Experimental Graphics and Literary Magazine. And during the summer, before I was supposed to go to Columbia University, I walked into my key artist's apartment. He was a brilliant, brilliant artist. And there was no furniture in the room. And he and his wife and baby were sitting on the floor, and they were all crying. And I asked what was wrong. And he said, "Our furniture's been repossessed. Our electricity is being turned off, our phone is being turned off, and we're being evicted from our apartment." And I said, "But your work is brilliant. If I just take it out to people who buy artwork for 2 weeks, I'll be able to get you enough jobs to pay your rent, and then I can figure out what I'm going to do for the summer before I go to Columbia University." And we ended up founding an art studio together, and at the end of the summer, I hadn't sold anything, Michael. I got New York Magazine interested in doing a feature on us, but I hadn't sold a bit of art. And I'm obsessive compulsive. Once I start something, I have a very hard time finishing it.
I just put a time window around this. This is early 60s, late 50s?
1968.
Oh, 68. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
The summer after the Summer of Love.
All right. Yeah.
The Summer of Woodstock.
Okay, so you could have had a pathway through academia. You could be a professor at NYU now, even still, but you took a different path.
And everybody knew I would be a college professor from the time I was 10 years old.
Right.
But to me, again, that looked like a railroad line that goes straight toward a goal without offering you any choice or possibility. And it looked like the home of the ovens, the wrong place to be. And 3 years later,
that's kind of a temperament thing. Like by personality and temperament, you're sort of a high risk taker or adventurous, or I'm not sure what adjectives you'd use to describe that. Some people like the idea of that straight pathway with no diversions, and at the end I have tenure and I'm done and I can just coast.
Right. Well, you're right. It's the risk-taking thing, and we study dopamine and the number of dopaminergic receptors that there are for people who are high risk takers versus people who are not, and all of that. Yeah, I guess so. Because I needed to follow the path I needed to follow. Look, the message I got out of science between the age of 10 and 12, my formative years in science, was that science is about the aspiration to omniscience. Since there is no omniscient being, it's our job to do his work or her work. And the obligation of science is to see things other people have taken for granted all their lives, and hence look through as if they were invisible, and bring those invisible things up to the light, and then come to understand them with the tools of science. So that was my primary obligation. It wasn't to make a living. It wasn't to have a career. It was to find scientific ways to describe things. And the book, in fact, the Einstein, Michael Jackson, and Me, A Search for Soul and Power Pits of Rock and Roll, though it's primarily rock and roll adventures, it's rock and roll adventures with a point. And the point underneath it is, what the hell is soul? What the hell is this ecstatic experience?
Yeah.
Why does it exist? What does it accomplish for us? And there are about 4 basic answers in this book.
Yeah, give it to us.
So, I mean, to give you the most people fixate on the music that becomes their favorite music for the rest of their life when they're 13 or 16 years old. Sometimes when they're 21 years old.
There is that theory that whatever we imprint on between like 13 and 25, music that we're exposed to, that becomes the music we prefer. Like for me, it's classic rock, sort of late 60s, early 70s. That's kind of my era. And when I listen to music today, I can tell it's good, but I always go to the classic rock stations because it vibes with me. What do we know about the neuroscience of that?
Well, we don't know a great deal. I'm getting together after all these years. Helen Fisher is the leading expert on romantic love.
Yeah.
And the second in the field is Lucy Brown. And Lucy and I were thrown together at a dinner last week because we share the same mentor in neuroscience, Ted Koons, who discovered what the hypothalamus does. And so the 3 of us are getting together. This may seem to have nothing to do with rock and roll whatsoever. But remember, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, sex and rock and roll are very, very intimately laced together.
I love that part of the book. Yeah, that was pretty good. I hadn't thought of it that way.
Right. So the question is, the real clue comes from Konrad Lorenz. Konrad Lorenz, when he was 6 years old, was hanging around with a little girlfriend on the margins of the Danube River. His parents had this incredible fairy tale country place. And they were watching ducks hatch from their eggs, ducklings. And the ducklings caught a glimpse of Konrad Lorenz and fell in love with him. And you know how little ducklings go in single file and they follow their mother, whether they're swimming or they're on the land? The ducklings started following Konrad Lorenz in single file. Then Konrad Lorenz, when he was a little bit older, kept jackdaws. He had a pet jackdaw. Jackdaw is some sort of blackbird, probably a corvid. And he kept this jackdaw, and the jackdaw fell in love with him, but at a different point in its life. The jackdaw, the baby goss or ducklings, had been little tiny fluffy babies. This jackdaw was an adolescent. And how could Konrad Lorenz tell that the jackdaw was in love with him? Because the jackdaw would fly up to the roof or up to the attic and out a hole in the attic and into the open air, would go out hunting for food, and would get a nice big juicy worm, and would chew the worm up to a mash, and then would come back and try to insert it in Konrad Lorenz's mouth, which is the ultimate courtship gesture.
True love.
Jackdaws, right. And when Konrad Lorenz refused to open his mouth, I mean, Lord knows why he didn't want mashed worm, right? The jackdaw would hop up on his shoulder and try to deposit it in Konrad Lorenz's ear canal. Well, later in life, Konrad Lorenz convinced them, after being a Nazi soldier, unfortunately, but he had no choice, Konrad Lorenz would come back from the war and would convince the most prestigious scientific organization in Germany, and hence one of the most prestigious scientific organizations in the world, the Max Planck Institute, to let him buy his parents' country place, to buy it in the name of the Max Planck Institute, and to turn it into a research station. So Konrad Lorenz would come bicycling up to this research station in the fairy tale forest, and it would be surrounded by the nests of ducks, geese, all kinds of birds. And Konrad would walk through the maze of nests to the kitchen entrance to the house. And he discovered one day that just as when he was 6 years old, a whole bunch of little baby goslings or ducklings were following him in single file. And they even came into the kitchen with him when he went into the kitchen. And they stayed with him for the rest of their lives, thoroughly imprinted on him, thoroughly convinced that he was their mother. So Konrad Lorenz came up with a theory. If this is an instinct, if this is a reflex, because reflex was a very big word in the field he was co-inventing at the time, ethology. If this was a reflex, then it should have a releaser. You know, the way the little hammer hit on your knee gets a reflex going and you nearly kick the doctor in the teeth if he's not careful. And you don't do that voluntarily. It's a total reflex out of your control. So he went to see if there was a specific kind of stimulator that would get goslings or ducklings to follow something. And he discovered that it could be anything from the size of a duck, a mother duck, to a soccer ball. And if he rolled that soccer ball past the nest at precisely the right time, that the gosling's mind, all of a sudden, their brain was open to a certain kind of stimulus moving at a certain speed, and they would latch on to whatever they saw that fit those characteristics as mother and stick with it for the rest of their lives. So that music has the same impact. You just described it when you're 16 to 21 years old. But there's another major facet of music in this book. Music provides a badge of identity and an anthem to a subculture. Often, in fact, it is the thing around which that subculture coheres, gathers together. The example in the book is you take a whole mess of salt and boil it into water, and you pour it into a water glass. And the water glass looks like just perfectly ordinary water. But if you drop a crystal of salt into what is called a supersaturated solution of salt, all of a sudden, all of the salt molecules sense a common identity, and they cluster together into a big, ragged, irregular crystal. They all find a common identity thanks to this tiny little releaser. And music is that kind of a releaser for subcultures. A bunch of people grow up with it, especially ever since 1815, when the rate of technological change picked up very dramatically. Every generation is born into a radically different group of circumstances from its parents. And at first, the kids growing up in that generation, when they hit the age of 11 or 12, suddenly feel very much alone because they have whole experiences that they don't see reflected anywhere in the culture. And they feel isolated and insane. And then something comes along, a releaser, that makes them feel not insane, makes them feel like a part of a group, makes them feel that there are others like them, makes them feel that, in fact, they're not just individuals who share something in common, they're a fucking movement, if you'll excuse my language. Yeah. And so when you, at the age of 15 years old, 16 years old, 21 years old, imprint the way that ducklings imprinted on Konrad Lorenz, when you imprint on a certain form of music, you are doing more than imprinting just on music. You are imprinting on the subculture that music represents. Yeah. And that subculture will stay in your mind for the rest of your life. Why? Because your brain literally does open a space for a certain kind of thing. And then it wraps itself around what fits in that slot, the releaser. And music is a very big releaser. Yeah. Now, here's another thing about the ducklings. When the ducklings hit puberty, they were horny. You know, all of us pubertal creatures are horny, especially males. And guess what sort of mate the ducklings, now full-grown ducks, wanted to have intercourse with? Somebody who looked just like good old mom, Conrad Lorenz.
Right.
So when Conrad Lorenz would have guests at that point in his duck's career,
true love. Yeah.
Yes, it would be terribly embarrassing.
So here you're linking sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Well, I don't know about the drugs, but it's a kind of drug, as Helen Fisher says.
Right.
And now let's back up for a second, just to put a scientific outline on this. So this imprinting theory becomes this sort of three-part sequence. The sign stimulus, like in the case of the seagull with the red dot at the end of its yellow beak, the red dot is a sign stimulus to the baby that pecks at it.
Right.
The pecking itself is a sign stimulus to the mother to regurgitate the food. So somewhere in both of their brains is this innate releasing mechanism, some neural network or a module or whatever metaphor we want to use. And that triggers a fixed action pattern, a so-called FAP, fixed action pattern. So this is clearly obvious in these relatively super simple animals like birds and so forth. You're actually making the argument that, you know, our brains are kind of along the same lines, at least for certain things. And rock and roll, or music in general, has that kind of base instinctual, kind of basis to it. So here I want to explore, since you've written a lot about evolutionary theory, this debate about to what extent the arts, music, literature, poetry, any kind of creative expression has an adaptive purpose in evolutionary theory. Therefore, we should look for how it led to reproductive success of those who engaged in it versus a kind of byproduct, spandrel. It's a cheesecake. There's nothing adaptive about it. It's just what comes with brains that are able to do these other things. So give us your thoughts on that.
That's Steven Pinker, the cheesecake theory.
Yeah.
And Steven, who is brilliant and who is usually right on target with things. Your books and his books compare as cultural landmarks. Steven Pinker's dead wrong about this. He is dead wrong. And let's go back to what we said about music a few minutes ago, which is we all need to feel a part of something bigger than ourselves. Actually, we didn't say this about music. We said this about religion, about the sense of gods. And we all do need to feel a part of something bigger than ourselves, but it's not just in the interests of individual survival. You know that my first book, The Lucifer Principle, argues for group selection.
Yeah.
Or what David Sloan Wilson, the leading champion of the subject, with whom I worked very closely back in the 1990s, what David Sloan Wilson calls multi-level selection, meaning that when Richard Dawkins talks about the selfish gene, he's right. Your genes are driving you to selfishly try to reproduce, so your genes, in turn, can reproduce themselves. But he's also wrong, because, first of all, no gene is an island. Genes work in massive teams. There are approximately 22,000 human genes, and all those genes have to work together as a successful team, or none of them will be able to launch itself into the next generation and insert itself into kids, into zygotes that become adults later on. Plus, humans do not operate as lone individuals. Take a lone individual and put them up against a football team, and then the football team can beat the bejesus out of him. But to put two football teams up against each other, and the individuals in those two teams have a better shot. And in fact, groups compete. And group competition is extremely important because when groups are driven to the bottom of the pecking order of groups, there is a pecking order of groups. There is what's called the dominance hierarchy of groups. And when a group is driven to the bottom of that dominance hierarchy, guess what it has a very hard time getting? Guess what its individual members have a very hard time getting? Sex. Because they are now regarded as a despised group. I mean, how many women in India were willing to sell themselves as brides to the Brahmin class who came from another class, a middle class or a lower class? Well, any girl pretty enough to do it wanted to do it because it put her in the upper class. But how many women from the Brahmin class were anxious to marry a guy from the outcast, from the untouchables? 0. In fact, it was illegal. It could be punished by death. So outcast groups have a very hard time getting sex. So if you want to actually get the right for your genes, your gene team of 22,000 genes, to reproduce itself in some form, you better damn well do everything in your power to get your group to move up the pecking order. Because the higher you go, the more sexual choices you have. So these things, the sense of being something bigger than yourself is intimately linked to your ability, the ability of your gene team to launch itself into the next generation.
So David Sloan Wilson had that book, Darwin's Cathedral, where he made the group selection argument for religion. So you're making a similar argument for music. It's a sort of social unifying, whether it's a group selection or the members of the group are themselves increasing their reproductive success through this kind of unifying aspect of music. So that's a separate thing from the belief in God is separate from the social role of religion as a unifying process for groups. Say, is there something more to music than just it unifies group? But we could be praying together, chanting together, meditating together. It's the togetherness that is part, or does music add something else to that as well?
There is something else, and see if this makes sense as something else. So my art studio, remember I co-founded an art studio, and for 3 years I built that art studio up, and I made it on the cover of Art Direction magazine, and I invented a new animation technique for NBC TV, and we did all of the advertising for ABC's 7 FM stations when they launched into a very experimental and risky new format called progressive rock in those days, otherwise known as album rock or rock radio. And ABC asked me to form an advertising agency to handle our entire account, but I didn't do it because I didn't want to learn how to book time buys. It sounded very boring, not at all what I was on the track of. And then I landed us a new magazine. Matty Simmons, a guy who had helped invent the credit card, had made a lot of money with it, and he wanted to be a publisher, so we went up to Harvard. There were a bunch of kids who turned out a magazine every single year, and every single year it went on sale in newsstands all over America and sold out in 2 hours. Every single year. So he convinced the kids involved with that year's issue to move down to New York. He would pay them nice salaries. They would live a luxurious life. They would be aristocrats. But instead of doing the magazine once a year, they'd have to do it once a month. And the magazine was called The Lampoon. So Matty's monthly version was called The National Lampoon.
Wow.
And I landed us The National Lampoon as our client. We were going to art direct the whole thing. And one of the members of my studio was a totally incompetent artist, but he was a good organizer. And he convinced at least half the other members of the studio that if they voted me out of the studio, they could collect this nice big fat check coming in from the National Lampoon every month, and they wouldn't have to give me my percentage. So they threw me out of the studio. And I had been writing, the Einstein imperative that you began to read a part of. So I remember that I was trying to know Einstein's theory of relativity by tomorrow morning before I faced the girl who told her mom that I understood the theory of relativity. And to the other kids, I was heavily immersed in science at that point and establishing minor scientific credentials at that point. And I was called the sickly scientist, and it was only my only claim to fame. It's not a name I came up with. They came up with it. The other kids came up with it to mock me. At any rate, so at 8 o'clock at night, I'd gotten 50 pages into the big fat book, which had nothing but equations on the page and a couple of words of English. And I don't understand equations. I never have. But I'd learned that if you put yourself through something really difficult, by the time you get to the end of it, you've understood something, even if you don't feel you have. But I had no time for that luxury. It was 8 o'clock at night. My mom was going to put me to bed at 10 o'clock that night. And by 10 o'clock, I'd better understand the theory of relativity. So I turned to the little skinny book. And I don't know if you've ever had this experience. I've had it several times in my life. In the introduction, written by Albert Einstein, it was as if Einstein grabbed me by the shirt, by the lapels, and put his nose up to mine and said, "Schmuck, listen up. To be a genius, and it's not enough to come up with a theory only 7 men in the world can understand. To be a genius, you have to be able to come up with that theory and then explain it so clearly that anyone with a high school education and a reasonable degree of intelligence can understand it." So Albert Einstein, another of my heroes, along with Galileo and Anton von Leeuwenhoek, was telling me personally that you had better turn yourself into a writer, and not just any writer, but a superb, delicious writer, a writer who can hold a person's interest out of sheer wonderfulness. So I set about on that mission from that point on. And I had wanted, when I started the art studio, I realized that the next step in reaching the kind of mass audience that Albert Einstein had told me to reach, intelligent people with a high school education, I was going to have to write for magazines. And I had become a contributing editor to an underground fashion magazine called Rags. I did 175 pieces for them. And then I became a contributing editor to a magazine called Natural Lifestyle. And I was still building this art studio from zero. And so it meant getting up at 6 in.the morning, going naked to this giant Remington manual typewriter from the 1940s, typing madly, getting dressed at 8 o'clock, going into the studio, doing my studio work during the day, and coming home and sitting at the manual typewriter again until 11 o'clock at night. And I was getting tired. And my artists, half of them had thrown me out of my studio. So one day I was covering, of all things, a parapsychology convention. And you and I both have similar views about parapsychology conventions. So I'm milling around with the mind readers, and this kid, a little bit younger than I was, came up to me. He saw me. I carried a pad with me everywhere because I was constantly taking notes. I was a journalist now. And he said, would you like to edit a magazine? And I thought, wow, if I edited a magazine, I could do my writing during the day, and I wouldn't have to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning. And I said yes. And he set up a meeting for me with a publisher. Now, Michael, remember the dim and distant days when we didn't have Google and the internet? So if you had a meeting schedule with somebody, you had no idea of who it was. Right. You couldn't look him up. There was no way you could find out a thing. So I went cold to this meeting at One UN Plaza, this gorgeous location looking up the East River, looking down the East River. You could see a ship literally go for 5 miles just from the windows of this office. And it turned out that the guy I was meeting with was the publisher of a magazine called Circus. And I thought, okay, elephants and clowns, I can adapt to that. If I love my audience sufficiently, I can do a good job on any topic in the world. I had learned that because after my freshman year at NYU, I had a writing job for the Boy Scouts of America, writing their pamphlet on stalking and tracking and camouflage, and the Boy Scout handbook chapter on masturbation, which seems to come in my life story more than it should, and a book called 10 Steps to Organize a Boy Scout Troop. And I had been thrown out of the Boy Scouts for incompetence of Morse code at the age of 11. And so I figured I can write as long as I love my audience about anything. And it turned out it wasn't a magazine about elephants and clowns. It was a rock magazine. So over the course of the next year, my publisher set out certain goals for me, and I tried to match those goals. And I created a whole new magazine format and brought it to him at the end of a year and said, I guarantee you that if you use this format, it will increase your sales. And I've only said that kind of thing 3 times in my life. Sometimes you know something.
Yeah.
Just surprising.
So this is how you got into the music business.
Yes, it was a rock and roll magazine,
Okay.
and we increased our circulation 211% in the following 12 months.
At some point, did you think, oh man, I'm giving up my science writing, research, or?
No, because I cannot give up my science. My science is built into my bones. It's built into
but I mean the time you spend doing something. If you're promoting Michael Jackson, you're not, writing about science.
Well, what I admired was observational science. What I admired is the kind of science that Darwin did, getting lots and lots of evidence, taking expeditions to really weird places in order to pick up evidence that will throw light on the more mainstream evidence that you've got. I never associated science with the laboratory. When I had worked at Roswell Park, the Roswell Park Memorial Cancer Research Institute, the largest cancer research institute in the world, at the age of 16, they put a scientist over my head to make sure I didn't break too much expensive equipment. And he took me into his office, and he had a desk about 6 feet long in his windowless office. And over on the left side of the desk were 3 stacks of books, and over on the right side were 3 more stacks of books, and all the books were in German. And he said, you see those books over on the left? I've read all of those books. See the books on the right? I still have to read all of those books. And until I've read all of the books on the right, I will not be able to synthesize the molecule I've been trying to synthesize for the last 5 years. And I immediately thought, this is not my version of science.
Right.
This is not what I want to do. I don't want to dig a hole so deep that I can't see anything else around me. I want to be the eagle flying over the landscape who sees all of those little holes from all the specialists as pixels in a big picture.
Yeah.
So, because I've been reading a lot of Nietzsche that year. My high school let me take a course in philosophy at the University of Buffalo when I was 16. Yeah.
Nietzsche at 16. So what you're saying, what you're saying is, in a way, while you're booking concert tours for Queen or Michael Jackson or whoever, you're also exploring this deeper question of finding God inside all of us. To what extent is this hindsight, writing a memoir, like, this is why I think I did that? Or were you consciously thinking that at the time?
It's somewhere around 50-50.
Yeah.
Because it took me time to piece it all together, but I was very aware. You could not remove the science from me, Michael.
Yeah.
I was just a science person, and I had learned from a poem by Edna St. Vincent Millay when I was 16 years old, who said that you can't see the infinite in the tiniest of things unless you've experienced every peculiar form of human suffering. That you must accumulate extreme experiences if you're going to understand the human psyche. And my desire was to understand not just the individual human psyche, but the group human psyche, what Émile Durkheim called collective effervescence. And in fact, when I became editor of Circus, first of all, because of that change in format that I made in Circus, Chet Flippo, the founding editor of Rolling Stone's New York office, one day messaged me 6 pages, typed pages in an envelope. Well, people in the press don't message 6 pages to people that can't afford it.
Right.
And I read it, and it was about a little guy who was spinning straw into gold in a windowless office at One UN Plaza. And it said that this character had reinvented or had created a new magazine genre, the heavy metal magazine. So that's apparently what I had done. And I know this was not separate from my science any more than the Voyage of the Beagle was separate from Darwin's science.
Yeah.
The Voyage of the Beagle was vital to Darwin's science.
I think we lost the thread on the linking between the internal experience of music and the social bindingness of it.
Well, if something happened the first month that I was at Circus Magazine, Fleetwood Mac were having a concert at Carnegie Hall. Now, there had been a bunch of British blues bands in the 1960s, and the last 2 remaining bands were Chicken Shack and Fleetwood Mac. And it was obvious that Fleetwood Mac and Chicken Shack were both on their last legs. This is before Lindsey Buckingham and what's her name came along. This is beeping again, and I have no idea how to turn it off.
It's okay.
No, not going to do it. Okay. So at any rate, so I go to this Fleetwood Mac concert. There are 3,000 people in this gorgeous auditorium. The band is busy playing on stage. I watch as something strange happens. As the lights go down, as the concert begins, before the concert, by the way, we are all very self-conscious. We all want the people on either side of us and the people behind us to regard us as cool. So we try to posture as being cool. Then the lights go down. And all of a sudden, those envelopes of identity, those attempts to seem cool melt away. And slowly we melt into each other. It's a remarkable phenomenon. And because I didn't know music, I had never really experienced it this way before. And then a half an hour into the concert, the lights go up in the auditorium on all of us concert listeners. The lights go out on the stage, and the sound system goes out on the stage. And clearly we have a disaster here. Plus, when the lights go up, all of us are subject to becoming self-conscious again and posturing for our peers again. But Mick Fleetwood, who's this 6'4" string bean of a man, comes to the foot of the proscenium, and he flings his fist in the air, and he says, "Fuck it, man. We're going to rock and roll." And the audience is galvanized in a way I've never experienced in my life before. And from that moment, and that concert became exhilarating, because when a group, you know this from Muzaffar Sharif's experiments,
All right.
when a group is thrown an obstacle and has to overcome that obstacle as a group, it bonds the members of that group in ways that are electrifying. And I saw that. I felt it. I was part of it in that concert. And that's when I knew I was in the land where the gods were.
Wow. That's a great story. So you were in the business for about 15 years, right?
17 years altogether.
17 years altogether. Yeah. I mean, your list of people you've worked with is, just amazing how highly accomplished they are. So I want to get your opinion on something, a subject I'm interested in, how lives turn out. To what extent it's nature, nurture, upbringing, chance, randomness, contingency, accidents, and so forth. And I'll come at it this way with Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers, where he popularized the 10,000 hour rule, and he goes, look, the Beatles had more than 10,000 hours and so forth. And and a popular tool I use of skepticism is the 2x2 matrix. So the 2x2 matrix, you have 4 cells. So in this cell, we have successful musicians, say, who put in their 10,000 hours. In this cell, we have people that put in 10,000 hours and they still stink, garage bands and they never made it or whatever. And in this cell, we have successful musicians that didn't put in their 10,000 hours. In the last cell, people that weren't successful and they didn't put in the time. So the problem with, that whole thing is are the exceptions to the rule, not to mention there's a lot more to being a successful musician, say, than just putting in 10,000 hours. So just from that matrix, just kind of walk us through all these people that have succeeded, and surely you've probably seen tons that wanted to be the next Fleetwood Mac or whatever, or even the story you just told. How did Fleetwood Mac become one of the greatest rock bands of all time from what they were before? What are the ingredients to make somebody successful or not?
Well, I boiled it down in the book to eating, breathing, and drinking your music. Because in the case of Prince's imprinting point, when I started digging for the souls of my groups, and that's what I did. If you came to me and you said you wanted me to represent you, I would give you a little speech. And the little speech said, look, if you expect me to fashion an artificial mask for you and give you an image and to sit here smoking a cigar claiming that image is going to make you a star, you've come to the wrong person. If you're going to work with me, you have to understand something simple and basic. And that is that music is not about an exchange of pieces of plastic or pieces of vinyl. It is not about an exchange of downloads. It's not even about an exchange of money. It's an exchange of human soul. And if you work with me, I'm going to work to find your soul. And if that you can't accept that, I'll get you an appointment with my best competitor, and you'll be sitting with him in 2 hours or less. So that was my goal. And what did I learn to do through trial and error over the course of time in order to find those souls? I learned to look for imprinting points, back to Conrad Lorenz.
Right.
And so when I first of all, when I was put to work on Prince, I followed the charts religiously. First thing Monday morning, I got all 3 trade magazines. I read them from cover to cover before doing anything else. And I had seen an unknown artist who was appearing on the black charts and then going platinum. And no one had ever heard of him. And I wondered, who in the world is this person? And then I got a call asking if I would work on a guy named Prince. And it was the guy who was making these albums that were going platinum coming out of nowhere with nobody knowing him.
Right.
And then I got a call from Warner Brothers out on the West Coast. I was based in New York, saying that you're going to have an impossible time with Prince. He can't do interviews. We tried to set up 2 interviews for him. He tried to strangle one of the interviewers. It's just not going to work.
Oh, my God.
So I demanded between 1 and 3 days with Prince in his own environment, and I got those. I got a night. I was flown to Buffalo, New York, which is ironically my environment, not Prince's, because that's where I grew up. But Prince had rented the Shea Theater to rehearse for his Dirty Minds tour. And I sat there with the audience. There was no audience. Now, audience of empty seats. I'm waiting for the rehearsal to finish. And then at 1 a.m, Prince and I locked ourselves in a room, and we were together until 9 o'clock the next morning. And it turned out the guys from Warner Brothers, the women from Warner Brothers, have been dead wrong. Prince was a wonderful interview. And what was I looking for? I was looking for imprinting points, because by that time I had discovered that that's where the roots of soul lie, with the things you printed on. And Prince's imprinting point came when he was 5 years old, a very standard age for imprinting. The age when Freud says you are vividly sexual, even if your parents won't acknowledge it. That's when little boys and girls go off into the closet to explore each other's hidden parts. And Prince's dad was a musician. Prince's mom had taken him to the theater where Prince's dad was rehearsing, much like Prince had been rehearsing an hour before in the auditorium. And Prince had seen his father on stage surrounded by 5 of the most beautiful women he'd ever seen in his life. And from that minute on, he knew he would become a musician. That was his only choice in life. So we're down to the question of the Malcolm Gladwell thing, the 10,000 hours. So Prince started working at his music maniacally. He worked at it so hard. He created a touring band, and they would tour on weekends. He went to the head of a local studio. Studios survive off of advertising jingles and things of the sort. And to create those jingles, they have to bring in studio musicians who charge a fortune.
Right.
Prince was so schooled at every instrument he'd ever tried his hand at, which is just about every instrument there is, short of those in a symphony orchestra, that he was able to make the following deal with the studio owners. I will come to your studio. I will do every single instrument that you need in order to complete your advertising jingles, if you give me the keys to your studio when you leave at 11 o'clock at night so I can record my own stuff. And Prince was so good at all of those instruments that he was equal to or better than the studio musicians to whom that studio had been paying a fortune.
Oh, my God.
And that's how Prince recorded his first album. So he was, by junior high school age, he had been out touring the whole state of Minnesota with a band. By the time he was 14, actually, he had made this deal with a recording studio. By the time he was 15, he had recorded his own record, composing every single song, doing every single instrument. And he went to visit his sister in New York City. And he, a 15-year-old, took this record he had recorded to one professional recording something or other, entity of some kind, after another. And 2 different production companies wanted to sign him. Now, I've known kids Prince's age who went looking for stardom, and if you offered them a contract of any kind, they would have assumed that that contract would make them a star, that they had it, that now it was just an easy ride to stardom. Prince never assumed that. He knew that these production companies wanted to control his image. They wanted to show him how to dress. They wanted to orchestrate his music. They wanted to control him. And Prince said, absolutely not. I will not sign with anybody unless I have total creative control of the music and total creative control of my outfits, total creative control of every graphic, of every photograph. Think of a 15-year-old making that commitment, making that demand. That's crazy.
Yeah.
And when he got his deal with Warner Brothers, every single one of those conditions was filled. So he was an eat, breathe, drink, and sleep your music person. And so were all of the other stars that I worked with the exception of John Cougar Mellencamp.
But what about the ones you encountered that never made it? It's not just that they didn't put in enough time, I suspect, because what you just described about Prince, he's obviously exceptionally talented, more than any studio. In other words, those studio musicians, they could put in 20,000 hours and they're not going to be Prince.
Right. You have to, it's a nature-nurture thing.
Yeah. In
your nature has to be a talent. And that talent is basically watered and fed by your 10,000 hours of work. And you do your 10,000 hours of work not because you have to, but because you can't do anything else, but because you love to, because you need to make music more than you need to do just about anything else in life. And let's look at Prince's imprinting point for a minute. What were its key ingredients? what were the releasers in the Conrad Lorentzian terms? The releasers were sex. His father was surrounded by 5 of the most beautiful women he had ever seen, and attention. It was a 1,500-seat theater, and every single one of those empty chairs was pointed at the center of the stage where his dad was.
Mm.
And there was a spotlight on the spot where his dad was. And in fact, that would turn out to be the imprinting point for lots. Kevin Cronin of REO Speedwagon, who's a far better vocalist and a far better songwriter than people give him credit for. Kevin Cronin first imprinted at the age of 5 on the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show. Well, what were the key elements of seeing the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show? Screaming girls.
Yeah.
Attention and sexuality combined. And then he imprinted all over again at the age of something like 14 on the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show.
Right.
And again, screaming girls. You couldn't hear the music. Attention and sexuality as the key elements.
Well, we think of Sinatra, Elvis, and so on, Mick Jagger, whatnot. Do female rockers get the same kind of attention from young men?
In the book, there's a history, basically, of how, for a long time, first popular music was a team sport. Men and women went out on dates and went dancing to jazz, and later to swing. And then something happened in the 1940s. All of the young men were drafted for the war. And that left a lot of very horny young women working or going to school back here in the States. And that's when Frank Sinatra appeared on stage. And the girls screamed and fainted for Frank Sinatra. They had been deprived of men for a very long time, and they badly needed one. And if it was one who was on stage who they would never touch physically in their life, so be it. And from that point on, the audience for popular music was screaming, fainting girls. It was screaming, fainting girls for Elvis Presley in 1956. And then in the 1960s, something strange happened. A new audience emerged for popular music. It was young men who were in the process of individuation in their lives, who were setting themselves apart from their parents, who were rebelling, and who needed a music of rebellion. And rock and roll, with its groups, its bands, was that music of rebellion. And so when Joan Jett went on stage, Joan and I worked from the beginning of her career outside the Runaways. When Joan went on stage, her audience was mixed again. It was males and females, but it was the females who resonated to the music as well as the males, because something had happened in the culture. Because in the 1950s, we'd had the era of milk and cookies moms. You know, your mom, you went off to school, you came back home in the afternoon, your mom was there in a pretty dress, and she fed you milk and cookies. Your dad, on the other hand, came to the breakfast table early in the morning with his suit and his briefcase. He set his briefcase down, took off his suit jacket, ate his Wheaties, and put his jacket back on and went off to this mysterious place called the city that you knew nothing about because you were growing up in the suburbs. Well, then in the 1960s, we had the women's liberation movement. Women had been liberated already by the washing machine and the dryer. A woman's job until the 1930s had been hauling water all day long, and before plumbing systems and hot and cold running water. And now women were free to go after the same kinds of jobs that men went after. So you had a generation of kids who grew up with a dad who came down to the breakfast table in his power suit and put down his briefcase and wolfed down his Wheaties, and a mom who came down to breakfast in her power suit, put down her briefcase, and ate her Wheaties and ran off to the office. And girls who grew up with this kind of experience had no voice. They had none. And then Joan Jett came along and insisted on taking over an instrument that was a male-only instrument, the guitar, the lead guitar. And she went up on stage and she pumped her fist in rebellion. And suddenly the girls who had seen their mom go off to power positions could relate to this and express that thing that made them crazy, that feeling of theirs that they thought was only their personal insanity. And all of a sudden they realized, hey, they weren't just personally insane, they were collectively insane. There was a movement there.
So she's serving as something of a role model for young women. But I'm asking a slightly different question. So, these male rockers who are getting all the sex they want, the women are throwing their panties and phone numbers and waiting for them at the hotel, and these guys are taking advantage of this. Do the female rockers bed these young men? Do the young men throw their phone numbers up? Do the young men wait at the hotels for them? And do the female rockers take advantage of that? Or are there gender differences in that kind of activity?
Well, the gender difference is huge. You go to a 38 Special concert, and you see 15 young women dressed absolutely gorgeously and as sexually provocatively as they can, and they're all standing backstage waiting for you can imagine what. No, there are no male groupies of that kind hanging around for females. Janis Joplin took advantage of her stardom to get as her bedmate one of the most gorgeous men that the earth has ever produced. He was a member of my art studio, strangely enough, and I only know the story through him. But she didn't go through 15 sexual episodes a night,
right?
Like a man. So all those things you've read about in evolutionary psychology about how men have enough semen to impregnate every woman on Earth. The single ejaculation,
right?
Well, actually, it's more like a lifetime of ejaculations, where the numbers are in the billions and trillions. But women have a very tiny number of eggs, and once a woman gives birth, becomes pregnant, then she has a 20-year responsibility on her hands, whereas the man can just skip town,
right,
and not leave his phone number.
So you're saying you witnessed this difference in the rock business?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
It was total and complete.
Now let's talk about just pure talent. Of all the people you worked with, I'm guessing Michael Jackson is 3 standard deviations out from anybody else, no matter how talented they were.
Well, I am very lucky to have met Michael Jackson, to have been close to Michael Jackson, to have had intense encounters with Michael Jackson, because Michael Jackson, yes, you can describe it by the 3 standard deviations thing. Michael Jackson is the closest thing to a saint on earth that I ever encountered in my life. And so in the book, I tell you the stories. He had qualities of awe and wonder that were beyond belief. Here I was out to find the infinite in the tiniest of things. And remember, Edna St. Vincent Millay, the poet, said that in order to accomplish that, you have to go through every extreme form of suffering imaginable on earth, every extreme kind of experience available on earth. Well, Michael hadn't been through every extreme kind of experience, and yet he saw the infinite on the tiniest of things. And the first 2 rules of science, the truth at any price, including the price of your life, and look at things right under your nose as if you've never seen them before. Michael Jackson was those 2 principles incarnate. It was astonishing. So in the book, I tell you the stories, which are jaw-dropping, of my experiences with Michael, and they're too long to tell here. But basically, I realized that, look, the task of evolution altogether is to constantly expand the envelope of possibility, not just for life, but for the cosmos. Because so far as we know, we're the only life forms in the cosmos. I mean, the odds are there are tons of others.
Yeah.
But so far we've looked and looked and looked, and we've only found us. So when somebody invents something new, like the pencil and the pencil sharpener, that's new not just to humanity, it's new to the entire universe. Well, so we have a perceptual envelope that's constantly growing. And Michael pushed beyond the bounds of the perceptual envelope with his ability to see astonishments in the tiniest of things.
Yeah.
He believed that his capacity for astonishment was something God had given him, and to produce astonishments. And that because God had given that to him, he owed that to his kids. And he carried those kids around him in his chest. One day, I was trying to convince Michael not to cancel his tour. And the full story is amazing, and it's in the book. It's in Einstein, Michael Jackson.
This is the Dangerous Tour, or which one?
This was the Victory Tour.
Oh, the Victory Tour, yeah.
1983 was when it was in prep, and this would have been early 1984.
But before you tell that story, let me just back up for a second.
Okay.
So, some of the, say, cultural declinists that I've debated about moral progress or cultural progress or not, One of the arguments they make is, in a world with a population, 50 times bigger than it was in Beethoven's day, why don't we have 50 Beethovens today? The equivalent of that. And one answer might be, we do, but it's Michael Jackson, or it's the Beatles, or it's, it's just a different form.
Well, I agree with your argument. I agree with it totally. We're looking for Mozarts in classical music. That's not the only category of music there is.
Yeah.
But once upon a time in the 1950s, all of us who were in science knew a simple fact, that humans are not physiologically built to beat the 4-minute mile. It can't be done.
Right.
And then Roger Bannister got together with a medical school colleague, and they analyzed his running, probably using films, step by step, to see how they could gain an extra gram of energy here, an extra joule of energy here, and an extra joule of energy there, until they finally got him to beat the 4-minute mile. Now, if you look up the 4-minute mile in Wikipedia, it says that every good competitive runner has beat the 4-minute mile.
Right.
So what Roger Bannister doing was expanding the envelope of human possibility. And that's what Michael Jackson has done in his life. And I try to show you who Michael was by telling you the stories of my experiences, which were very intense with Michael.
Yeah.
So you can see that if you could live up to the standard that he created, the way that every professional runner now lives up to the standard Roger Bannister created, you would be pushing open the envelope of human perception.
Give us one of those.
Culture.
Give us one or two of those stories.
Well, I got a call one afternoon saying, you've got to be out here by 11 o'clock tonight. Michael is canceling his tour. And I kept a little knapsack behind my desk, a little red nylon knapsack that had a TRS 100, the very first laptop computer, and a spare shirt and a toothbrush and a razor. So I strapped it on. I told my assistant to find me a flight out to California. She did. And I flew out to California. And I went to the address I'd been given. I drove my rental car to the address I'd been given. And it didn't turn out to be what I expected. It was a studio lot. And it was one of these giant hangar-like buildings on the studio lot. And because it was 11 o'clock at night, these hangars swallow light. No matter how much light you have in there, it seems to be nothing. It seems to be a candle in an infinitely dark world. So I went into this aircraft hangar-sized studio, and the Jacksons had a 110-foot stage in the front. They had all of the lighting that was necessary, all of the sound equipment that was necessary, and they were rehearsing for their tour, the Victory Tour. So I waited until they were finished, and then we all trailed out to a little trailer. And these trailers are set up as dressing rooms. They're common whenever you're making a movie or when you have a big production of this kind. So we went into the trailer, and the trailer had two banquettes of seats parallel to each other, two benches, red plastic benches. And there was a side bench right by the door that was the throne. So Michael took the throne, and I took the seat to his immediate left. Now, up until that point, we'd had a terrible problem with this concert tour. It was getting horrible, horrible press. And one reason was that a guy named Dave Marsh, who was very highly placed in the press community, had been leaked information, and he was going on television and telling people that no one we know, meaning nobody that the rock crit elite, the rock writers knew, had been hired to build the stage. Nobody we knew had been hired to build the sound system. Nobody we knew had been hired to do security. And nobody had been hired to do the lighting system. And since we know everybody who's of any consequence in the business, that meant that the stage was going to collapse, that the sound system was going to electrocute the musicians, that the lighting towers were going to fall down on the heads of the audience and kill tens of people, and that there was going to be no security, and gangs were going to be running up and down the aisles with knives, knifing people at random. None of this was true. But I found out why those rumors have been able to proliferate. Michael was sitting on that throne-like banquette, and I was sitting at his left hand, and Michael explained to me, look, basically he was saying, God has given me this gift of amazement, astonishment, and surprise. It is my job to amaze, astonish, and surprise my kids. When I started putting this tour together a year and a half ago, I signed absolutely the best people in the business. But I made each of them sign an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, agreeing that they would not tell anybody they were working on my tour, and they wouldn't tell anybody anything about my tour, because my job is to give absolute astonishment to my audience. And if my audience doesn't know what's coming, that's when they're going to be startled and surprised. And as Michael is saying these things, well, then Michael explains, my brother Jackie is the best dancer and choreographer I have ever seen in my life. Now, remember, Michael had studied Fred Astaire and all the great dancers. And to say that was really an astonishing accolade. And he said, my brother Jackie came down with a bone chip in his knee, and they thought it would be healed by now, but it hasn't. And I have to postpone the tour until Jackie is better, because I cannot go in front of my audience, my kids, with anything that is substandard. I have to, basically, he was saying, I have to go in front of my kids with something absolutely transcendent. Because my job is to lift them out of themselves. And as Michael is describing this, I had a vision. And it was as if Michael's ribs were made of gold. They were golden gates. And I could see those gates opening. And I could see 10,000 kids in Michael's chest. And there was no way he was going to let anybody screw around with those kids or deprive those kids. So Michael had a good motive for wanting to postpone his tour. But I had to explain to him, you know, sometimes, I don't know if this has ever happened to you, sometimes you go into prophetic mode. You know a truth. You know it profoundly. And when you convey it, you are not quite human anymore. There is a strength and a passion in you that defies any kind of normal. And Michael was being prophetic. He was telling me his truth, and it was coming across as an absolute with a power that is beyond belief. But I get prophetic too when I know something to be true.
Yeah.
And I knew what this was going to do to Michael's tour. The credibility of the Jacksons had been called into question now for 5 months in the press. And this was going, a delay in the tour would prove that the tour was Amateurville. And those kids wouldn't be able to come, the kids that Michael wanted to reach. Their parents would not let them anywhere near the Jackson tour because their parents didn't want their kids killed while trying to go see their favorite artist, Michael Jackson. And when I finished delivering my message, Michael said, okay, we won't cancel the tour, which is apparently why I had gotten the phone call worded the way it was, which is, you've got to be out here tonight. Michael is canceling his tour. You're the only one he will listen to.
What'd you do about the dancer?
He went on stage without Jackie.
Okay.
He did it because he did not want to harm his audience. His audience were everything in the world to him.
Yeah.
They were everything in the world. And again, Michael was the truth at any price, including the price of your life person.
So back to where we started with the search for God inside of us. Would you say Michael Jackson was the closest to there being a God that there is, at least in our generation?
Michael Jackson, yes, that's an accurate statement. That's an accurate statement, as astonishing as it sounds. Michael, I've met many, many important people. I've worked with all the stars that you've talked about, plus Buzz Aldrin, the second astronaut on the moon, Edgar Mitchell, the sixth astronaut on the moon, the 11th president of India, Dr. APJ Kalam, who in fact was a visionary and has been the most popular politician in South Asia for decades now. All kinds of people that are stunning. And I have never, ever run across anyone like Michael in my life, which is one reason this book is so important to me. It's not just a matter of what I found with my science by taking the craziest field expedition of all time, even crazier than the voyage of the Beagle, because I had no companions. Michael or Darwin did. But what I discovered was Michael Jackson. And Michael Jackson must be understood because he will expand the envelope of perception and possibility for humanity. And this book tries to bring Michael Jackson into your bones and muscles the way he is in mine.
It reminds me of Richard Westfall's biography of Sir Isaac Newton called Never at Rest. The opening paragraph of that biography, just an introduction by Westfall, is that, paraphrasing, it's been my good fortune to meet really smart people in all walks of life, particularly in the sciences. But with all of them, I could look at them and think, well, I'm half as smart as this guy or a third as smart as that woman or whatever. He said, but with Isaac Newton, there is no comparison. He is just like on another plane that there's no one else you'd put like half as smart as him or whatever. He's just transcendent in that sense. And
it's an extremely valid statement, Michael. Mike, there's a Latin phrase for this, sui generis.
Yeah.
So beyond any category that it creates a category of a whole new kind.
Yeah.
So the only category I've got to put Michael Jackson as an angel, a saint, closer to the divine. I'm an atheist. And yet the divine is an experience I've been on the track of since I was 12 years old. And this was field work. This entire 15 or 17-year episode in rock and roll was field work in what in the world infinity is.
All right, I got to bring up the super sensitive subject of Michael Jackson's the accusations against him. You touch on this in the book. I like how you give a lot of background to it because I think it helps people to understand why somebody would make up a story if somebody made up these stories. Starting with the Boston Globe and the Boston Herald, I think it was, and the Herald. Right. The Herald was always behind the Globe by 10 or 20,000 subscribers per day. And the Herald decided, we're going to run a story about Michael Jackson, and then that like tripled their circulation. On the cover. The whole cover on Michael. And this was, I guess, the early 80s. And this sort of triggered this idea, hey, if we just write stuff about Michael Jackson, it's good for business. And then it's a small step to say, well, we'll exaggerate a little bit, and then we'll make shit up. Like tabloids, they just make shit up all the time. So this kind of sets the stage for these accusations. In the 90s, I remember that this was unfolding in Santa Barbara County here because I live in L.A., but of course it was a worldwide story. Those trials that he went through, he was acquitted on all those charges. It was like 14 charges, and he was acquitted of all of them. But I have to say, the interviews he gave were just not, they were not exculpatory for him. I mean, when he would go on about having milk and cookies in the bed with the children, it's like, oh my God, if you think this makes you look good, stop talking. So I mean, he did not have a normal childhood. I mean, his father had a normal childhood. Father was abusive, and all the other siblings were jealous of him, and never had a childhood, and so on. And then he died, and now we have this documentary film that everybody is seeing, Leaving Netherland. And I have to say, I watched it and I thought, oh my God, these two guys come off as totally credible. And so I guess he's guilty, but it's troubling that he can't be here to defend himself. And then one of my friends and colleagues, who I work with closely, has investigated this, and we may do something on this very subject. So he writes, of the second allegations in criminal trial in 2003 to 2005, Michael had an ironclad alibi for the dates of the alleged abuse. He was in Florida, not in California, which his attorney, Mark Garrigus, publicly disclosed on NBC's Dateline. The dates were then changed by the prosecution. One of the current accusers, Wade Robeson, who is one of the two young men in this film, now they're not young men anymore, an adult at the time, was the first witness brought in by Michael's defense team, and he testified nothing ever happened to him under penalty of perjury. He testified the same as a child during the 1993 investigation. In a unanimous verdict, the jury found Michael Jackson not guilty on all 14 charges, in part because of the testimony by this young man, at the time, now one of the men in this documentary film. After Michael Jackson died, the same Wade Robeson contacted Michael's family to invite himself to the funeral. Here's what he wrote for the booklet distributed at the memorial service. Quote, "The last time I saw him was July 2008. I was in Vegas working on a show, and he was living there. Me, my wife, and him and his 3 kids had a barbecue. It was the most normal thing in the world. Me and my wife had been to Whole Foods and bought stuff to cook, but when we got there, he'd provided loads of catering. I said, dude, why did you bring loads of catering? We've got regular food here. I remember cooking outside while Michael sat there under an umbrella. We had great times because he was such a caring person. Most of all, I missed those phone conversations. I still have my mobile phone with his number in it. I just can't bear the thought of deleting his messages." And then my friend and colleague here who's researching this writes, In 2011, this guy Wade Robson, tried to get a job choreographing the Michael Jackson themed Cirque du Soleil show in Las Vegas. The Michael Jackson estate considered him, but ultimately decided not to hire him. He then claimed he had undergone psychotherapy that helped him uncover repressed memories of sexual abuse and filed a lawsuit against the Michael Jackson estate, seeking damages of up to $1 billion. He was joined in the lawsuit by James Safechuck, who as a child starred in a commercial with Michael Jackson and testified in 1993 that he wasn't molested. The lawsuit was dismissed by court. Then he went on to produce the award-winning documentary Leaving Netherland. So this is so disturbing because he comes off as a weird dude. Like, totally I could see why he, be doing these things with young boys. But then you read these accounts and it's like, wait a minute. You see these two guys talking in the film and you're like, totally credible. I believe they had sex with Michael Jackson when they were boys. And then you read this stuff, you go, okay, you recovered this in therapy? We know that doesn't work. We know people make up stories, maybe not intentionally, but they confabulate, they misremember, the therapist leads them with questions and so on. And I don't know, what's your take on all that?
So how did you conclude? Did you conclude that Michael was guilty or innocent?
Now, personally, I think he probably did not do the things that these guys said they did in terms of actual sex with young boys. My guess is, though, he was kind of weird in this regard because of his abusive father, his child that he never had. I can believe that what he said. I had milk and cookies in the bed with boys and spent the night with boys, which is really a bad idea for the optics of it. But from there, I don't know. I'm inclined to just say, innocent until proven guilty. He was never proven guilty. In fact, he was acquitted based on these two boys' own testimony before they went to psychotherapy. So that makes me suspicious.
Well, there's a psychotherapy racket about sexual abuse.
Yeah.
It's been going on since approximately the 1960s.
Yeah.
So it's now 60 years old. And these therapists believe deeply that we have all been sexually abused.
Yeah.
So they believe deeply that if they are doing therapy for you, your therapy is not complete until you have recovered memories of sexual abuse.
Right.
And we know from the memory work of Elizabeth Loftus that memories can be implanted, that suggestion changes memory. You eventually start incorporating suggestion as your own memory to the point that you can see vividly what you believe you are remembering. So, for example, Elizabeth Loftus in a classic experiment showed college kids a picture or a film of a car coming down a road, and there's a bicycle, and it's on a flat plane, and the car hits the bicycle. Or it's the bicycle hits the car. So then, and she asks a bunch of leading questions after the film is over. When the car was approaching the intersection, what was the blonde driver doing? When the bicycle passed the barn, what was the bicycle rider doing? Now, there is no barn.
Right.
There is no blonde driver.
Right.
The driver is brunette. And 2 weeks later, they bring these kids back in and ask them to recount the story of what they saw in the film. And most of them remember vividly a barn. It's just searingly built into their memory circuits of visual memory. And they vividly remember the blonde driver when in fact the driver was brunette and there was no barn.
Yeah.
But these therapists will work with you week after week after week after week, trying to convince you that until you remember being sexually abused, you're not free of your therapy. You're not completing the therapeutic process.
Yeah. And
inserting hint after hint after hint until there is what Elizabeth Loftus demonstrated in her research.
Yeah, my favorite experiment here is the Lost in the Mall. Where she gets through family interviews, the person she's going to do this experiment on, that they were never lost in a mall. Then to this adult, she says, do you remember being lost in the mall? Oh, yes. And do you remember hearing your voice, your mother's voice on the piano? Oh, yeah. And the guy what did he look like? Oh, the guy that found me, he had a plaid shirt on and a hat. Whatever. I mean, they just make up this incredible story. Now they're not lying. You know, it's a false memory. It's a confabulation or whatever.
Right.
And you know, Elizabeth has testified in a number of these controversial court cases, like well, she didn't testify in the Demoniac case, Ivan the Terrible. It turns out he wasn't Ivan the Terrible. He was from Treblinka. He was Ivan, the really bad dude from Sobibor. But in any case, you know, and she recently testified in the Harvey Weinstein case. So here's the problem, though, that this is not like psychic power that doesn't exist. Child abuse does happen. And there are people that abuse children, or there are children who are sexually abused by their parents and so forth. That's a real phenomenon. So you're bumping up against a signal detection problem. You know, we want to get it right, that, you know, we properly convict the person who really is a molester. The problem is we're going to, you know, if we loosen up the standards of evidence, we're going to get a lot of type 1 false positives and convict innocent people. I think there's some of that, and it's made worse by the fact that Michael Jackson was so famous and rich, and, you know, and when there's financial awards available, you know, that brings the lawyers out to encourage the psychotherapist to recover these memories. Right. And, you know, and then you get sort of a mass hysteria, panic set in. But of course, we don't want to tighten it up so much we never capture the real molesters, because there are real molesters. And the troubling thing with Michael Jackson is, you know, not only because he was so transcendent as a talent, but that he can't defend himself anymore. And so, so people ask, you know, can I still enjoy Michael Jackson's music? Yes, of course you can, I say.
Right. Well, I tell a story in the book of something that happened to Billy Joel to give you an idea of what may have been going on here. So one day, Billy was basically reenacting the Elizabeth Loftus scenario in the real world. He was on his motorcycle. He had a green light. He kept going at 40 miles an hour, the speed limit. But there was a car coming from the perpendicular direction, and that car had a red light. And what do you do at a red light? You stop, right? Well, the car didn't stop. It went through the red light. Billy tried to apply the brakes, and it was too late. So his motorcycle hit the car, and he went flying over the car and landed on the other side of the car somewhere. The driver, a 29-year-old woman, opened the door, rushed out of the car, was hysterical. She was afraid she had killed him. And in fact, he was in danger of losing the use of his right hand, which for a guy who only comes alive when he's on the piano in front of an audience, it would be a terrible loss, and a loss to all of us who are Billy Joel fans. He was medevaced to a Manhattan. He was out on Long Island when this happened. He was medevaced to a hospital in Manhattan. They were afraid they were going to lose the use of his right hand. They managed somehow to patch it together. He's still missing a bone from his big finger on one of his hands. And apparently the driver of the car went to a lawyer. And because she was obviously criminally liable here. And the lawyer said, look, you got a superstar here. He's worth a fortune. You didn't hit him. He hit you. Threatened to take him to court. If you threaten to take him to court just to keep bad headlines out of the newspapers, he will pay you off. And in fact, I believe that Billy paid her off with $250,000, which in those days was a lot of money. Today, in superstar terms, it's pocket change. But it was a big amount of money. Well, Michael was a sitting duck. Michael had not had a childhood. It wasn't just an abusive father. He began to rehearse with his brothers when he was 6. Their father was a musician. He had a guitar that he kept in the closet. The kids were not supposed to touch his guitar. And as a parent, you can understand laying down the law to your kids about something you really value like that. And the kids, with their mother's encouragement, would sneak the guitar out of the closet and would rehearse as a band, as an act. And Michael was doing this from the age of 6. From the age of at least 9, possibly earlier, he was on stage in front of audiences. He never had a childhood. Now, there's a guy named Jaak Panksepp who did research, all kinds of amazing research on baby rats. Baby rats, when they're little, play with each other. And what they're really doing is establishing dominance hierarchies. Who's on top of who? with their playing. But it's fun. And you could hear them squealing and they're having a wonderful time. Well, Jaak took some baby rats out of the group so they couldn't play during that period of their life. Then when they hit adulthood, he put them back into the group. So what did these rats who'd been deprived of play in their childhood do? They played obsessively. They were suffering from play deprivation. Michael Jackson was suffering from childhood deprivation, and he truly loved his kids. He loved children who had the kind of childhood he had never had. One day we were doing a photo shoot out near you somewhere on the beach, and we had Lamborghinis and all kinds of astonishing cars.
Great story. Such an LA story.
Right, and it took 3 hours for the photographers and God knows who else to set up these cars for a photo shoot. So the brothers all hung out in their dressing trailers. Not Michael. There was a fence at the far side of this little park area that we had taken over. It was a wooden rail fence, and there were kids on the outside of that rail fence. Michael went over to the kids, and he spent the whole 3 hours with those kids. Michael was suffering from childhood deprivation. It made him resonant to the frequency of children, protective about children, crazy about children, crazy about their ability to have the awe, wonder, and surprise that he wanted to convey to every human he possibly could as his gift from God that had to be passed on. So Michael never had what you and I would call a bedroom.
Yeah.
Bedrooms for you and me are private places. Close the door and you're all alone. Not Michael. Michael's bedroom was always a public place. When Lionel Richie, who was also a client of mine, went over to Michael's house to write "We Are the World," the song to raise money for Ethiopian people starving. Yeah. They lay on the rug together, and they were writing the lyrics back and forth, and all of a sudden, Lionel sensed that something was eyeballing him at the precise height of his eyeballs when there he was laid out on the ground, and it was very suspicious. So he turned his head slowly to the right, and what did he see? It was Michael Jackson's pet snake, Muscles, that was apparently evaluating whether he would make a sufficient dinner. So Michael's bedroom was not a private place. It was a public place. So when he had milk and cookies with kids, remember how exciting. Remember the first sleepover that you ever participated in?
Maybe.
And how exhilarating it was?
Yeah.
And how you couldn't stop talking until the sun was about to come out? Well, Michael prized that experience with kids, apparently. And that's why he had kids over, and the kids' parents were not at all concerned about anything sexual happening. Not at all concerned. It wasn't until one parent realized what the woman who crashed with Billy Joel realized, that you could extract money, that this was Mr. Moneybags.
Right.
And all you had to do was make a false accusation. And that accusation would be the kind that would make headlines and destroy Michael's career, so Michael was going to have to pay you off. And once one person does something, other people start doing it. Yeah. It's not exactly Rupert Sheldrake's morphic resonance, where once something happens, all of a sudden a channel is open for all kinds of stuff. No, we humans operate by imitating each other, by example. And once one person has established a pattern, other people jump into that pattern. And even if it's only a half a dozen people out of the hundreds of millions who adored Michael Jackson, that's enough to kill your career.
Yeah. Yeah, we published an article last year on Jerry Sandusky, which I just assumed, like everybody else, was guilty as hell. But there's a book about his case and how questionable or problematic the so-called eyewitnesses were. Most of it, they didn't see anything. They know somebody that said they saw something, kind of thing. Some of them went to therapists. But once Penn State, well, actually the state of Pennsylvania, opened up the coffers and said, we're just going to pay everybody. We've set aside hundreds of millions of dollars because there's so many victims. This was so horrible. We have to make this right, which is understandable why they feel that way. Then the lawyers come out of the woodwork like, oh boy, okay. Now, as far as I know, Sandusky he's a child molester. I don't know. But the instances or the evidence he was convicted on, to me, at least, following this book, the book is called "The Most Hated Man in America," and it's pretty problematic. So there is definitely that effect. Once you have the therapists involved and the lawyers involved, then it becomes, unless you have some other really tight smoking gun of evidence, and that does not appear to be the case with Michael Jackson. Although I think at Netherland there were private bedrooms, at least according to the account of these two young men. Although again, this is decades after the fact they're telling these stories. Who knows?
Well, again, if Michael considered his bedroom to be private, he wouldn't have brought Lionel Richie in to write the lyrics. There would have been some other natural place. Right. But the bedroom was obviously the place where Michael was most comfortable functioning.
Yeah.
We were out on the road on the Victory Tour. I mean, I was out on every single date until somebody got me thrown off of the tour, precisely because Michael and I had a very actually profound relationship. It wasn't just an ordinary relationship by any stretch of the imagination. And Michael, we would take over 2 floors of the best hotel in town. I would be on the first of those floors. Michael and the brothers would be on the floor above me. Michael would have a private room, and in this case it was private. The door was closed an awful lot of the time. It would have adjoining doors to the bedroom next door, and Michael traveled with this beautiful woman in her mid-30s who was the mother, or maybe 40, who was a mother, had her own 3 kids, and she had her husband's permission to come out on tour with Michael. And that's the person with whom Michael would spend his time. And there were no kids, there were no groupies, I mean, no children, no nothing.
Wait, what was she there for? What was her role?
She was just a companion.
Michael
mean a
friend?
Had her she was there as a friend.
But they weren't lovers.
But they weren't lovers, or her husband would never have let her out on the tour. But that's what Michael needed. He needed a mother figure, possibly. Who knows? I never asked Michael about it. But it was not an arrangement that led you to believe that Michael was having sex with children at all. So it is hard for me to look. You never know what's going on in a person's private sexual life, and sexual life is the most imprinting thing imaginable, and you can't help what you imprint on, and you have to have a reproduction of some kind of that which you imprinted on in order to have a sexual climax. So I mean, I've lost 2 friends to sexual hangings, because when you hang yourself, you get an erection.
Oh, right.
No matter what. And if you can unhang yourself in time, hey, you live through it.
Oh my God.
So sex produces some very peculiar properties in all of us. And it's back to those Conrad Lorenz ducklings, who once they reached adolescence, they'd spent their lives with Conrad Lorenz. So if you were a house guest, if you came over for dinner or came over to discuss research with Conrad Lorenz, the ducks would want to fornicate with you. So there's a big, and we can never say precisely what did or didn't happen with Michael sexually.
Yeah.
But all of the evidence that you're citing, all of the evidence that I can see, tends to indicate. And remember, I'm terribly biased on this. Yeah. I love Michael. He will be in me, in my heart, for the rest of my life, and he will be setting a standard that is beyond any standard any previous human that I know of has set for me for the rest of my life, and I will be doing my best for the rest of my life to convey that standard so it does not get lost, and it does what Roger Bannister did.
Well, I'm biased. That's a good place to kind of wrap it up. We've been going almost 2 hours. This is now a record length for me. This would be a short episode for Joe Rogan, but for me, it's fairly long. I love the book. And so the final page, and where does music fit into this? Everywhere, like the salt crystal in the supersaturated solution. It pulls groups together. It uses ecstasies to give a new generation a sense of collective identity. It uses musicians to express inner emotions that most of us thought made us insane. It uses music to put you and me on the same page and to help us march to the beat of the different drummer. It uses music as our group's badge of identity, and it uses music to help our group climb the pecking order. In other words, music is the groin-deep voice of two things, the group and sex, two creations of the gods inside, and two of the sources of the fire with which those gods sometimes come to life. That's some pretty powerful writing there, Howard. Congratulations on your book. What's next on your docket of writing projects?
Well, I have two books that I need to get to when my time finally gets free. One of them is Everything You Know About Nature is Wrong, The Case of the Sexual Cosmos.
Everything?
Originally called Everything.
Okay.
Yep, Everything You Know About Nature is Wrong, The Case of the Consumerist Cosmos.
Okay.
Was its original title. And the other is The Grand Unified Theory of Everything in the Universe, including sex, violence, and the human soul.
Okay.
So
I should point out to my listeners that you do have a film out the same time as this new book is out called The Worldview According to Howard Bloom. And
The Grand Unified Theory of Howard Bloom.
Yeah, it's the Grand Unified Theory. That's it. Yeah, Grand of Howard. So that I presume touches a little bit about what that book is going to be about.
It tries, but it's very hard to get a wrap on this. It tells, Look, Michael, try this. Try putting your left finger through your right palm.
Yeah, I can't. Oh,
okay.
Yeah, okay.
Did it go through?
Yeah, no.
Okay. What kept it from going through?
Well, as I understand it, is explained by Feynman at the Salon Institute in Big Sur, is that, this idea that it's mostly empty spaces should be able to pass matter through matter, is that the atoms are jiggling. Feynman's word. They jiggle. The little electrons going around, they're not really going around. It's an energy shell. But the jiggling of the atoms keeps them solid.
Right. And so, yes, it's basically protons, to sum it up in another way. And now, how old are you? Are you less than 100 years old?
Yep.
Aha. And how old is that part of you in your hand that kept your finger from going through?
It's billion-year-old carbon.
13.7 billion-year-old protons.
Right.
So if I'm going to tell you the story of your life, I have to start with the Big Bang.
Okay.
So this
is a big picture book.
So this is the story of the universe in 77 episodes, leading up to what you're doing as you're having this conversation with me today.
So this is the climax of the Big Bang right here, you and me?
Yes.
Climax. You get a climax.
This is the latest social project, because this universe is all about social projects.
And sex.
An atom is a social project. Galaxy is a social project. Yes. Sex is a social project. And culture. Right now, you and I are spinning gossamer webs for the culture.
Right.
And that's part of a social process. And social processes produce the most astonishing of things, like life and consciousness.
Howard Bloom, thank you for coming on the show. Thank you for your work. I read all your books. I love them. It's super interesting to see your mind at work, particularly in real time here. Thanks for coming on the show.
Michael, you're an absolute pleasure. I hope to see you again soon.
We'll do it again for the next project.